Alrighty, hi guys. If you're watching this, it's because we are going to do some more practice with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So here in this video, I'm going to work through 3 problems using our 5-step process. So if you haven't already, make sure you watch the lesson notes from aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we know that we can use our graph sketches following these 5 steps to solve any aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So these 3 problems were originally from a worksheet I was going to give in class, so we'll go through it together. I'll do a couple of them and also leave some problems for you to try on your own with the answers in the rest of this 3.2 module. So the first step when we're solving one of these problems is going to be begin with the model and long-run equilibrium. So we're going to sketch the long-run equilibrium here before I even read this problem. So long-run equilibrium, we're going to start with our axes. We've got P for price level up here. I have Y for real GDP here. We have a vertical long-run aggregate supply curve, and it's vertical at Y star, which is our long-term output. That's the level of output our economy produces when it's healthy. And when we're at a healthy level of output, that means the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate, which is what U star represents. So this is our long-run aggregate supply curve. I'm going to give that a little number 1. We also have a short-run aggregate supply curve, so we're going to graph that. It's upward sloping, so we're going to label that short-run aggregate supply 1. And then we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, AD1. So this point where they're all crisscrossing, this is called a long-run equilibrium. You got to start and end with all 3 lines crisscrossing. So this is our starting point. So as tedious as all this labeling is, it's important so we can figure out what happens to Y, U, and P in both a short run and long run equilibrium. So here the problem says, suppose this year there is a decrease in world oil prices. Determine how this event affects the price level, the unemployment rate, and real GDP in both the short run and the long run. So some people get confused when I ask about what happens in the short run and long run, that it means by default this curve that has the word short run in it must be moving. But when I say a short run equilibrium and a long run equilibrium, it means any of these could move initially. It just means what happens when demand and supply intersect in the short run and intersect in the long run. So just look at the event, a decrease in world oil prices, and you can always reference back to the PowerPoint slides to see what changes there. So just as a reminder, if you jump back here in the notes to this last one, factors that can shift only the short-run aggregate supply curve. The first one are resource prices, specifically labor and energy, inputs used wisely across the economy. So here, we're not changing the resources themselves, we're just changing the price of the resource. So it's going to be this short-run aggregate supply curve. So that's the next step, and we have to figure out the direction. So this one's kind of counterintuitive, but if resource prices actually decrease, that means my suppliers are actually going to supply more. This line is going to shift to the right and increase because now it is cheaper to produce things, right? It's cheaper to transport things and all that good stuff. So we'll call this SRAS2. So just as a reminder, input prices fall, just like in this problem. SRAS increases or shifts to the right. So that's what we drew here. All right, so now these tables can come in. I want to figure out at my new equilibrium, and again, we're kind of have 2 intersection points, but we want a supply and demand intersection. We're going to call this guy lowercase b. I mark it with a lowercase letter because it's just a short run equilibrium. And we are going to draw little dotted lines out to each axis. So in the short run, my price level here, I'm going to call this P2, is going to be lower, right, as a result, because producers can produce things for cheaper. This is my new level of GDP. I'm going to call this Y2, and it's higher than where we started, so y is going to increase. And y is increasing above that long-term healthy level. We only change the long-term output level if this vertical line shifts, if we have one of those big changes in resources, technology, or institutions. So this isn't one of that. This is just a temporary boost to the economy. This is like an expansion. So when this happens and we're in an expansion, unemployment's going to be very low because GDP is higher than its potential. It means the unemployment rate is actually lower than the natural rate. So unemployment's going to fall, or you could write U is less than U star here. So that's our short run equilibrium. Now we have some rules that we follow because we started with a short run shift. If you go to the last slide in these aggregate demand, aggregate supply notes, you can see there's some patterns that we follow. When the second bullet point, when an aggregate demand problem begins with a short run only shift, we've got a new short run equilibrium. We just labeled that. And then SRAS always goes back to where it started. So if you look at this, that long run supply curve doesn't move. That aggregate demand curve doesn't move. The only thing that's going to change is we're going to go back to point A here. This short run aggregate supply curve eventually is going to shift back to the left. This will become SRAS3. And this will kind of become our final equilibrium point C, if you want to think about it that way. Everything goes back to normal. So you can say the price level goes back up, GDP goes back down, and unemployment goes back up to where U is equal to U star. So short run aggregate supply shifts, whether they're decreases like the example that was worked in the notes or a temporary increase here, everything goes back in the long run. So really, at the end of the day, you could say this goes back up, or you could say no change here from the starting point. You say no change for all of these, depending on how the question's phrased. Now, remember, your tests are going to be multiple choice, so the answer choices will be something like the price level goes back to where it started, or the price level is no different from where it started, so I won't try to trick you with the different phrasing. This is just kind of a shorthand for working through these worksheets here. All right, so next we are going to try this second problem here. So this problem says, suppose that a government thinks that it's important to have a high-valued currency relative to other currencies of the world. For this reason, the government orders a reduction in the amount of currency, driving up the value of that currency. Determine how this action affects blah, 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 price level, unemployment, and real GDP. Those are these variables in the short run and the long run. So step one, draw your long run equilibrium. I know this will get tedious, but I promise you it's harder for me right now on this little annoying graphics tablet thing. So this is LRAS1, vertical at Y star, U equals U star. This is our short run aggregate supply curve, and this guy here is my aggregate demand curve. We got point A, and we've got our starting price level P star. Okay, so we've got a couple events here. We're reducing the amount of currency and driving up the value of that currency. So go back, reference the notes. If you look at your notes all the way in the beginning here, you could look at this a couple different ways. You could say we're reducing the amount of money, so the quantity of money is falling. That's going to decrease aggregate demand. Or you can look at driving up the value of that currency. So if you go here, the value of $1 goes up, aggregate demand shifts left. So no matter which one of those factors that you focus on in the question, either a decrease in the money supply or an increase in the value of $1, the result's the same. Aggregate demand is going to move to the left. So that's what we're going to draw. So this aggregate demand curve is moving left of the original. So we're going to call this guy AD2. So that's the hard part, figuring out what events shift what curve. Now we just follow our pattern. So we've got two new potential equilibriums. I'm going to mark my new aggregate demand with the short run supply curve first. We're going to call this guy lowercase b. We've got this new, we'll call this y2. We'll call this p2. So we can see at this short run equilibrium, I've got a lower price level decreases. I've got lower GDP, so GDP decreases, and my GDP is lower than my potential, so we're in a little bit of an economic contraction. So that means unemployment is actually high. U is greater than U star here. So unemployment is going up. U is greater than U star. Okay, so that's our short run equilibrium. Again, if you go to the end of these notes, now that we know how the problem starts, we can just follow a pattern to figure out the rest. So this bottom bullet point, when an aggregate demand, aggregate supply problem begins with an AD shift, we've got our new short run equilibrium, just marked that, just filled in the table for that. And then going into the long run equilibrium, short run aggregate supply will shift the opposite direction, okay? So here I had aggregate demand go to the left. That means this curve is going to go to the right. So this intersection is going to be important, but the way we get there is we have to move this short run aggregate supply curve out to the right. So it goes right through there. I'll call this SRAS2. And this will be point C. We'll call this P3, give it a little star. And now I know I'm done with my problem because I've got all three curves, an aggregate demand, a short run aggregate supply, and a long run aggregate supply all intersecting. So in the long run, the price level is going to fall even more, but real GDP is going to go back up or no change from the original. And unemployment is going to go back down or no change from the original. It goes back to where it started. So this is kind of a complicated one. The reason that we have this kind of multiple shifts here is because here at point B, we had some prices fall, but this is a short run equilibrium. Eventually, in the long run equilibrium, the rest of those sticky input prices, that price falls again. And if you remember, when input prices fall from the previous problem, short run will shift to the right. But it's always going to follow this pattern down here. Aggregate demand will shift one direction, we get a new equilibrium, short run shifts the opposite. The only change will be the price level every single time, just like the one we worked in the notes. So that's that one. And the very last one I have for you is we have some widespread corruption that has impacted the U.S. political system. Our country has erupted into civil war and political instability. How does that affect the price level, unemployment rate, real GDP, blah, blah, blah. So, step one stays the same. Got P and Y and long run, aggregate supply. Short run, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, point A, P star, Y star, U equals U star. That's everything. All right, so we have corruption, we have civil war, we have political instability. So this one requires a little bit of higher level understanding, because you have to remember that one of the institutions from our economic growth chapter was political stability and the rule of law. Here, that is clearly collapsing in the United States if we're erupting into civil war. So if you go back to these slides and you look at what can shift our long run aggregate supply curve, would be changes in institutions here. So here we have institutions deteriorating, getting worse, so long run aggregate supply will shift to the left. So it's not enough just to know that institution shifted. you need to know the examples of those institutions that were discussed in 3.1, economic growth. Got to put it all together. So we do know, as far as this problem and this topic is concerned, that this long-run aggregate supply curve is moving to the left. So I'm going to draw a new one. We'll call this label it up here, LRAS2. And because I moved this vertical line to the left, I'm going to have a new value for Y star. I have a new lower potential, so I'll give this a couple stars so it makes sense. So at this new level of potential output, my unemployment rate is still going to stay at the natural rate. So still, when our economy is doing its very best, we're just going to have a lower level of output, a lower level of potential GDP, because we have all this violence and political corruption. So to finish this off, we just follow our patterns. So here, this first bullet point says when aggregate demand starts with a long run shift, it takes the short run with it. So long run went to the left, so short run is going to go to the left as well. Aggregate demand, though, is not going to move. So when you move this line, make sure it goes through this new intersection with the aggregate demand curve that didn't move. So this will be my new SRAS2. We'll call this guy point B. I've got all three lines intersecting, and this will be my new P star. We'll call it 2. So you can see, as a result, price level is going to increase in the short run and in the long run, because they're both crisscrossing at that same point. Real GDP is going to be lower. And then for unemployment here, I'm not super concerned with you understanding what's happening to unemployment. We're not in a temporary expansion or contraction. This just means the economy got worse. So you can still just say U is equal to U star. I don't have any cyclical unemployment here. I don't have a fluctuation in the natural rate. It just means even if I have all my workers working, some are busy fighting in a civil war right now. So we're not going to be as productive. So when I have these shifts for the long run curve, it's not super important that you know that unemployment is fluctuating. And so those are kind of 3 problems, the 3 patterns that we can take. So the third one starts with an long run aggregate supply shift. So that's that first pattern. This one started with an aggregate demand shift, and then that first one we looked at, if I can get over there, oop, not what I wanted, this guy right here started with a short run only shift. So you can see they're going to kind of follow those same rules right here when it starts with each of those, just like the ones from the notes. So I'm going to do another one of these and let you guys try some on your own, just upload what would have been the worksheet in class, and let me know if you have any more questions. Thanks.